you.
Yeah. How's work going?
It's good.
I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you tuning in on Eastern time, but maybe it's morning or evening, or some of the folks who are watching the live stream are. I want to extend my sincere thanks to you for attending or tuning into our event titled Left Behind. We were in Tibetan Diasporas under the new administration. My name is Elise Anderson, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at working on special initiatives at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, where I work on topics such as Uyghur issues and transnational repression. New Lines, as you might know, has been working on Uyghur issues since 2020 under the leadership of Director of Special Initiatives, Dr. Azim Ibrahim. And in 2021, published a landmark report using expert legal analysis to apply the 1948 Genocide Convention to China's ongoing treatment of Uyghurs. We're delighted to continue our work on Uyghur issues through this event and to consider other PRC origin diaspora groups, including Tibetans as well. And we're also grateful to the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, who's provided support for this event. Before the event gets started in earnest, though, I want to introduce you to the moderator for today, Professor Eric Schlussel. Eric Schlussel is a social historian of China and Central Asia, whose work focuses on Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, in the 19th and 20th centuries. He has published an award-winning, truly excellent monograph titled Land of Strangers, which uses local archival and manuscript sources in Chinese and Chaghatai Turkic to explore the ramifications of a civilizing project undertaken in the last decades of the Qing Empire. He has published also a critical translation of a really significant manuscript from East Turkestan, along with many articles and book chapters, and is currently working on at least a couple of major projects. He's pretty prolific, Professor Eric Schlussel. He's also a public intellectual fellow with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And I would just like to add a really good friend of mine for the last 20 years. So I'm very excited to see what he has put together in this event today, and I will turn the floor over to him. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Elise, for a really, really generous bit of introduction. Thank you. Thanks very much to the New Lines Institute for hosting this event and for providing the catering for those in attendance. It's really, really very generous. I'm very happy that we can find a space like this to hold this kind of conversation here in the heart of Washington, D.C. I myself am a longtime reader of New Lines' email newsletter. I'm glad to finally be here in their offices in person. And thanks to everyone here for being inside what's turned out to be a really beautiful day in Washington, D.C. It's exceptionally beautiful out. I put together this panel where I get to present the social scientist and activist and lawyer Ashma Setivaldi, JD, as part of my participation, as Elise said, in the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And as part of that, I had to put together a public event that will bring some kind of vital perspective on China to the kinds of audience who need it most. Okay. And in this case, I'm proud to be bringing a perspective I think has been really neglected over the past several months in our national discourse on China and U.S.-China relations, and those perspectives of people who are in some ways the most affected by geopolitical wrangling, great power competition, and sort of geopolitical rhetoric, but are often least best positioned to tackle those ramifications. And that includes a number of different sectors, of course. In China, this includes sort of workers' rights activists who've been increasingly oppressed over the past decade, includes LGBTQ+ activists, women, other marginalized groups in China. But I would say that Uyghurs and Tibetans have a very special place in the US-China relationship and have for a very long time. America, both as a society, as a culture, and as a government, takes a special interest in these particular groups. Decades of presidents have met with the Dalai Lama over the years, and Americans as a whole have developed a strong sense within our culture of the situation of Tibet vis-a-vis China. Uyghurs have been on the American radar, in fact, since the 1930s, and Uyghur leaders have long cultivated close connections with US government support. But it's only recently, with the growing crisis in the Uyghur region, of East Turkestan or Xinjiang, has the US seriously begun to take notice, and the activism has turned into legislation and action on the part of governments. And for quite some time, Uyghurs have become an explicit priority in US-China relations. But from my perspective, that's clearly changing now. I should say that, as Elise said, I'm a scholar of the Uyghur homeland past and present. And at present, I'm also the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at GW, just a few blocks away, where we have a serious and endowed program in Uyghur studies. We have programming on Tibet, we have programming on China peripheries and borderlands of various kinds. And I've been watching this situation quite closely, of course. And I'll say that, early in this administration, when Marco Rubio was appointed as Secretary of State, I think many of us in this space saw it as perhaps a guarantee that Uyghurs and Tibetans would remain a high priority for the administration. And while I personally don't support an overly or performatively aggressive approach towards China, I do believe in the importance of taking strong, ethically grounded stances on human rights, especially where it concerns oppressed, marginalized, minoritized peoples. And of course, that support from the government has always been married to certain streams of financial support as well as rhetorical. But instead, since January, the arrival of the new Trump administration, from the perspective that I have, from my base of knowledge, we've seen vast cuts to precisely those programs that have done the most to support these diasporas around the world, through agencies such as USAID, NED, and others. Funding from those agencies, whatever we may think of them, has supported well-vetted and low-cost projects that promote youth education and organization among diasporas, building resilience, political acumen, networks of organization among exile communities. And it's not to mention the shuttering of most of Radio Free Asia, which has become, for better or worse, not only a leading source of news for many groups, especially for Uyghurs, but also a key employer of prominent intellectuals from these communities. You know, cuts to the Department of Education are hitting programs at universities close to my home that have long served as homes for people in exile from Uyghur and Tibetan groups. Think of Indiana University, for example, which for decades has been famously a home of Uyghur studies and Tibetan studies, but it's also a place where key members of those communities have gone to find their own voices politically and intellectually, to articulate new visions of community, to advocate for themselves and build knowledge about their home communities in exile. And so at the same time, anti-immigrant policies may be endangering precisely those people who have come to the US to escape oppression at home. So in short, what I see is kind of a two-pronged issue. On the one hand, the Trump administration, while taking a strong rhetorical anti-China stance, has not been a strong supporter of the Uyghur Tibetan movements, or perhaps not in the same way that the previous Biden administration or the previous Trump administration was, that we saw in previous years. Women had to be corrected on those points. On the other hand, there's been withdrawal of the material support that makes a rhetoric real for people who need it most, and that brings support to people where they need it to retain resilience and growth of their communities in exile. That might be felt most strongly on the ground, not only in places like Turkey and Kazakhstan and India, but maybe even here in the US. And so, as we deal with a whole storm of images, stimuli, questions that have emerged out of the administration over the past 6 months, I want to take a pause and ask and to hear from the people who have done the work on the ground in these movements where things really stand for Uyghur and Tibetan and other Chinese diasporas. Have they been left behind by the administration? What is the actual state of affairs? What are the crises? What are the opportunities? Are there ways we can correct the record about what's happening today? And so today I'm very happy to have two important voices from those communities join us. Immigration lawyer Ashwar Senewalde and the activist in social science, Dr. Tselon Rigson. We're going to have both give their own remarks in turn, and then I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions, and we'll open it up to the audience here in the room for a bit of Q&A. I believe Tselon's going to go first, so I'll introduce you if you don't mind. Very good. So Dr. Tselon Rigson was born in Tibet and escaped to India as a refugee in 1992. He did his early schooling at the Tibetan Children's Village School in Dharamsala in India, completed his bachelor's and master's in social work and community development from Mangalore University in India. While studying there, he served as president of the Regional Tibetan Youth Congress and the Tibetan Student Association. He was then chief organizer of the first All India Tibetan College Student Conference in 2006, which has been held every year since then. In 2012, he was selected for the Tibetan Scholarship Program, which allowed him to graduate with a Master's in Development from Emory University in Atlanta. And then he worked as Deputy Director of the Tibet Fund in Dharamsala. He completed his PhD in Social Policy and Economics at Columbia University. He's written a great bilingual book about exiled Tibetan community problems and prospects, topic of our discussion today. And today he works as a city research scientist in the Mayor's Office of New York City, where he's also a fellow at Columbia Population Research Center and a diversity fellow at American Public Policy Analysis and Management. So without any further ado, Dr. Tselon Rigson.
Thank you, Professor Eric, for this very generous introduction. And thank you so much for New Line Institution and National Committee for U.S.-China Relations for putting this event together. I'm very honored to be part of this panel with my fellow activists from Uyghur and Professor Eric. I'm not here today in any official capacity. I'm here simply as an ordinary Tibetan, someone who has experienced up close both the brutality of Chinese occupation of Tibet and also the extraordinary strength and resilience of Tibetan people over these many decades. It's been almost 65 years since China illegally occupied Tibet, and right now I believe our movement is at very critical turning point. Inside Tibet, the repression has intensified, especially after Xi Jinping and his pursuit of the Chinese dream. And China has built a massive, vast surveillance state with help of modern technology to monitor every aspect of Tibetan lives. One of the most heartbreaking development in recent time is the expansion of colonial-style boarding school in Tibet. By some UN estimate, around 1 million Tibetan children, that is almost 90% of Tibetan children below age of 18, are forced into these boarding schools, separated from their parents, their heritage, their language, their identity. And for last 60 years, Chinese government has been trying to erase Tibetan identity and also trying to win the minds and hearts of Tibetan people by using all the tools in the toolbox. But they have failed this for this many decades, not because of lack of force, but simply because they fail to understand the uniqueness of Tibetan heritage, the identity of Tibetan people. And one clear sign of this is that since the Chinese occupation in 1959, there has been a continuous protest against Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet. And in more recent times, there were around 160 Tibetans burning themselves to protest against Chinese occupation. It's unprecedented in the history of mankind. This many group of people burning for sake of their freedom. They could easily harm anybody. They are courageous enough, but they chose to self-sacrifice as a ultimate form of protest. And Tibet is still a very closed society. It's almost impossible to get information from Tibet. And Freedom House, which ranks freedom around the world, consistently put Tibet on one of the least free region in the world, less free than North Korea, a country like North Korea. In fact, in the 2023 report, the score for Tibet, freedom score for Tibet was 1 out of 100. For North Korea, as a context, it was 3 out of 100. And for 2024, the score was further decreased to 0 out of 100. So basically, it's a very unfree society. I want to provide a brief historical context for the Chinese occupation of Tibet. The Chinese claim that Tibet had been part of China since ancient times, without being able to point any specific time reference, which in reality Tibet had never been part of China until it was illegally occupied in the 50s. Scholars like Professor Hong Sheng-Nu, who was a professor at City University in Hong Kong, who spent many years reviewing historical Chinese documents, including ones that are approved by CCP, have concluded unambiguously that through his articles and book that Tibet has never been part of China until 1950. And similarly, Dr. Michael Van Praag, an international law expert and conflict resolution scholar who taught at Princeton, also came up to a similar conclusion through his research, and he said, Tibet, by international law, is an occupied territory, and China has no legitimate legal claim over Tibet. That was his conclusion. So the question was, why did China invade Tibet? I think, simply put, it comes down to power and resources. In terms of the side of Tibetan Plateau, it's almost 2.5 million square kilometer, which is 10 times bigger than United Kingdom. And if Tibet were a country, it would have been 10th largest country in the world. And Tibet sit at very hugely strategic location. And among many Chinese military strategists, they often say that he who controls Tibetan Plateau controls the rest of Asia. And it's also very rich in natural resources. And Tibet is said to have the world's largest reserve of natural gas. And also it has a large reserve of lithium. China currently is world third largest producer of lithium, and the Tibetan Plateau is cornerstone of that lithium production. And also Tibet is also known as a water tower of Asia. All the major rivers that flows in Asia comes from Tibetan Plateau, and it's about a quarter of world population depends on these rivers. And just recently, just last week Saturday, Chinese Premier Li Chang went to Tibet and officially started construction of soon to be the world's largest hydroelectricity dam with a capacity of around 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually. That is 3 times larger than the capacity of Three Gorges Dam, which currently is the largest. So as far as trying to resolve the conflict is concerned, we have been engaging with Chinese government for many years. Between 2002 and 2009, we had about 9 rounds of discussion between the envoys of Dalai Lama and Chinese government leaders. And the last round was in 2009, where we provided them a document called Memorandum on Genuine Autonomy, which postulate how Tibetans seek a meaningful autonomy within the framework of Constitution of People's Republic of China. So basically, through this proposal, we are not seeking for independence from China or separation from China, but rather a meaningful autonomy. But Chinese government flat out rejected this, and since then there have been no any engagement with the Chinese government. Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama just celebrated his 90th birthday and made an announcement about his next reincarnation. His presence and his messages still inspires us, but some, including Chinese government, think that once he is gone, Tibet issue will fade away. And I and 7 million Tibetan people don't believe it for a second. The Tibetan movement is not just about one individual, however remote that individual may be. It's really about the dignity and freedom of almost 7 million Tibetan people, and it's about people who endured immense suffering and still continues to resist. One of the most concrete sign of building for a long term is that since 2001, we have democratically elected government in exile, which we call Central Tibetan Administration. And this entity is not just a symbolic or placeholder entity. It's a real organization with a real leadership that is we elect every 5 years, and also an institutional mission of restoring for Tibetan freedom. Over the years, many government and NGOs have supported Tibetan government in exile. Beside Indian government, the United States has been one of the largest supporters for our fight for justice. In fact, I myself is a product of such support. I came to US first in 2013 as a part of Tibetan Fulbright Scholarship to study at Emory University, and that program was made possible through a Tibet Policy Act of 2002. Along with this program, there are many different programs through the United States which support the Tibetan cause. And also this support also include about $8 to $9 million annually for Central Tibetan Administration, which account to about a quarter of total budget of Central Tibetan Administration, which is about $40 million. And this funding helped us to provide for the healthcare and education need of almost 150,000 Tibetan refugees in India and Nepal. Unfortunately, that funding was recently frozen by this administration, and impact had been severe. In fact, I was speaking with one of my friends who works in the settlement, Tibetan refugee settlement, and he told me that they were not able to hire new nurses because of these funding freeze. So it truly have a real life impact on vulnerable Tibetan refugee populations in India and Nepal. But just a few weeks back, the U.S. State Department just announced that the funding for CDA will be restored, and so that was huge relief for us. But still, we are very much concerned because the key program, I think, among all the programs that the United States government provided to Tibetan people, the most consequential, important thing is introduction of Tibetan program between Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. And this has still been closed. And for any movement in exile, I think the most important thing is the connection between people inside occupied territory and people outside occupied territory. And these Voice of America and Radio Free Asia not just act as a news outlet, but it's the only medium through which we can connect to people inside Tibet, in our case. And it's only source of uncensored information for Tibetans inside Tibet. So this is really heartbreaking for Tibetan, not just for Tibetan, even for people in East Turkestan and also millions of Chinese democracy activists. And so these cuts are not just a financial cut. It's really we've been working really hard for the fight against authoritarian regime, and such cut not just financially kind of weaken us, but kind of sometimes it's morally weakens us, and also it's further inspires those authoritarian regime to continue their oppressive regime. So in fact, soon after the news of the VOA and RFA's closure became outside, the Chinese, I think it's China Daily, a CCP's mouthpiece, celebrated this closure, and this itself tells us what's at stake. So today, I hope we can talk more about, as a researcher and as an advocate, can push to restore these programs and support those still fighting for these authoritarian regimes, so that democracy and freedom prevails. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we'll turn the remarks over to Ajmer Siddiwali, as an immigration attorney and a human rights and international development professional. Most recently, Ajmer served as program manager at Freedom House, which has come up a couple times in the conversation already. At Freedom House, she designed and led initiatives supporting diaspora communities. Throughout her career, Ajmer has provided pro bono and low-cost immigration support to the Uyghur community, while consulting with grassroots organizations, researchers, journalists, and government agencies on Uyghur rights issues. So like Ceylon, she's been in it, as one of the reasons I really wanted to have her here today. Ajmer holds a JD from William & Mary Law School and dual bachelor's degrees in poli-sci and journalism from the University of Oklahoma, where she also worked as a freelance journalist for local newspapers and radio. So, Ajmer.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you, New Line Institute, for hosting this important event. So these past 6 or so months have been quite interesting under the second Trump administration. It's certainly been quite different from this time under the first Trump administration, when we were first starting to hear about the re-education camps in the East Turkestan and the Uyghur homeland, and then reports of mass detention were coming out. I was still a law student then, and we're working with some of the students who realized that they can no longer return, and we're now trying to seek asylum in the United States. So much has changed since then. It's escalated into a genocide, with the United States and many Western governments recognizing the mass atrocities that are taking place in the Uyghur homeland. And some things have not changed that much, including transnational repression, which is on the rise. I want to provide an overview of the good and the not so good, and the changing landscape that we're operating in today. And then perhaps a little bit later, I'll have an opportunity to provide some suggestions on how we might be able to move forward. So on the good, there has been an expansion of Uyghur advocacy in recent years, especially youth-led and grassroots efforts. So we're seeing some organizations moving towards greater professionalizations, accessing increased resources. We're seeing a lot of women and youth leaders within the advocacy space in the Uyghur community. We've also seen over the past few years stronger engagement with Uyghur communities in Turkey and Central Asia. I would lament about sort of the gap between the Eastern and the Western Uyghurs in the diaspora. And I think we were able to bridge some of that gap with these initiatives in Turkey, in Central Asia, partly thanks to US government funding. And I'll talk a little bit later about how those programs are affected now that that funding has been cut short. There were also some progress on resettlement efforts on the topic of immigration and a greater move of Uyghurs in the diaspora towards the Western countries. So Canada, a couple of years ago, committed to resettling 10,000 Uyghurs. They started that initiative somewhat last year with only a handful of people making their way to Canada. We're not sure how much of that is going to span out in the coming years. But over the past couple of years, we've seen some irregular migration of Uyghurs from Turkey, Central Asia, along the US border into the United States, and I've had an opportunity to work with some of these asylum seekers. So our community in the United States is certainly growing. Complementing the growth of advocacy efforts, there's been greater emphasis on community and resilience building efforts with more cultural and community organizations emerging, tackling issues such as mental health and trauma, legal needs, livelihoods, language. Some of these programs were supported by, let me emphasize, were supported by US government funding. And then we also saw, especially over in the past 2 years, a greater move towards cross-movement solidarity building. So we saw increased connections with Uyghurs, Tibetan, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, Chinese democracy activists, and then an initial effort to even reach out to Southern Mongolian groups. We saw the recognition of the genocide and mass atrocity by Western groups, as I mentioned earlier, and legislation to condemn and address those human rights abuses, most prominently the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020 under the first Trump administration, and then under the Biden administration, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act of 2021. I want to move on to some of the points of crises and some of the major challenges that we faced in recent years. Among them, a leadership crisis and sexual harassment scandals among prominent Uyghur groups in the United States and Europe and Turkey. That's really eroded trust within the community. Also, increased burnout, suspicion, disassociation. That's pointing to a likely decline on Uyghur advocacy. As I mentioned earlier, we saw an expansion of Uyghur advocacy with a lot of new groups emerging, but with so many years of activeness and then the confusion coming under the second Trump administration, we're seeing sort of that lag and headed toward likely a great decline in Uyghur advocacy. We've also seen fear and disassociation and alienation among the Uyghur community, especially as people try to navigate transnational repression, which is on the rise, and an opening up of travel to the homeland, and that complicates relationships and dynamics in the diaspora as people, navigate that space of how they interact with people coming from the homeland or going to the homeland. And then a major issue, and so I'll also address this, the funding cuts. The funding cuts and weakening of major institutions like USAID, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at State, USIP, NED, who has been like a traditional funder for Uyghur and Tibetan Hong Kong groups. These have weakened major support systems for the Uyghur advocacy space. The decline or termination of media outlets like Radio Free Asia and Voice America, the just defunding has created a vacuum of information, and with China's propaganda campaign on the rise, we're really facing a critical time. So it's going to challenge our ability to understand the human rights situation in the homeland and make that news accessible to the diaspora. And then from this, my greatest fear is that it's creating this dangerous illusion of normalization, that things are gonna, go back to pre-mass atrocity phase within the Uyghur community, as there's confusion about the shifting U.S. policy toward China, China's rising propaganda, the TNR, as well as easing of travel into the homeland. So I might mention that prior to 2017, there were a handful of Uyghur organizations operating not just in the US, but across the globe. And we saw a surge after that because everybody had a stake. But now, as people start censoring themselves, alienating themselves from the community, as they start reconnecting with family in the homeland, we will likely see a decline. And that, coupled with the defunding of Uyghur groups, will drastically impact the Uyghur advocacy space. I think perhaps like one more, like I want to talk a little bit about sort of that shifting and reshaping of China policy in the United States. There is some confusion about how China policy is being shaped under the second Trump administration, and where Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, China democracy activists fit into that equation. That and the authoritarian behavior that we're seeing in the United States and the limited understanding of what's happening and the shifts in the policy and practices in the Uyghur homeland is exacerbating the other issues, the fatigue, the confusion, the alienation, and I think really points us toward a decline in the Uyghur rights space. Sorry to paint quite a grim picture, but I do have some silver linings and calls to action in events.
Well, let's turn to that in a second. So first of all, thank you to both of our speakers for painting this very honest picture of what's going on. I want to emphasize again that we're all here in our personal capacities, talk about issues that we deeply care about. And I really appreciate the candidness with which we can have this discussion. But I do want to begin though with optimism and hope, because someone you talked about morally weakening issue that comes when disappears. That's where you talked about alienation and about the erosion of trust. And these are all sort of emotive problems, right? These are how we feel about each other in movements. Someone recently told me that universities run at the speed of trust. And when trust breaks down in an organization, then you can't move anymore. You end up frozen in place. So I guess what I want to ask both of you is, where do you see the best opportunities to build that trust? What gives you hope for that positive feeling in your movements? We'll move on to other questions from that, but I do want to begin on sort of maybe an optimistic note. In a sense, like, where do you find the trust? Where do you find the moral strength? Whoever you
I think as a Tibetan, a first-hand experience of being under Chinese colonization, I think the fundamental source of strength does not really come from the front end, from any external sources. It's really comes from what Gandhi calls indomitable will. I think there's a kind of deep intergenerational commitment within Tibetan people. I mean, we have lived with the Chinese for thousands of years. So it might seem almost hopeless for Tibetan people, but we have lived with for thousands of years, and I'm absolutely certain. My inner voice tells me that we will be able to restore freedom for Tibetan people. And one clear motivation that recently happened to me, I mean, not too recently, but in last few years, was when Rishi Sunak become the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, I was thinking about his forefathers, his ancestors. When India was under British rule, nobody had imagined that a country will be free, let alone one of their son ruling United Kingdom. And it actually happened in front of our eyes. So I was really happy to see that. And in real political game, the changes happen so fast, and things will seem impossible until it happened. So ultimately, I'm very certain that Tibet issue will prevail, because the biggest weapon that we have is truth, determination, which can't be it can be swayed for some people, but majority collectively it can't be swayed by any resources or any manipulations.
I'm going to come back to on indomitable will the arc of history. That's a great thread I want to back up on in a second. Ashra, do you have thoughts about optimism, hope, and trust?
Yeah, I really do think we have to be proactive about driving change. And I've seen a lot of change in proactivity in recent years, primarily from youth activists, young Uyghurs who've grown up in the diaspora, who may not have as strong as sort of a connection to the homeland as the older generations who come from the homeland, but have really taken up the mantle and really developed professional initiatives that are really open to reaching out, to building coalitions with other movements, not just the Tibetan Hong Konger, but other movements against colonialism, for rights, climate, all of these social justice movements, and really don't have as much of the baggage that the older generation has brought with them. And so I'm seeing that, and that makes me optimistic. They don't have as much of a tolerance for some of the the corruption, some of the misconduct issues as well. So I'm seeing them having these conversations. Unfortunately, not a lot of these conversations are happening openly among more prominent Uyghur organizations, but I'm seeing the youth having these difficult conversations and start to navigate it and think more about how they sustain the movement, not just surviving today or surviving through the effects of the Trump administration's policies or the increased TNR and propaganda that the Chinese government is driving. But how do they sustain this movement? How do they grow in the diaspora? And then one day, how do they take that back home? To have something to take back home. And that gives me a lot of hope.
So when people ask me for optimism about the Uyghur movement, I say look to the youth movement. I mean, the level of work that has been done with very little funding, basically through indomitable will, the willingness to create and to talk about open space is extremely impressive to me. Actually, let's talk about the organization issue too, because there's always been a sort of asymmetry between the Tibetan and the Uyghur movements, hasn't there? There's Dharamsala, there's a well-established government in exile, there's a Dalai Lama who's now named a successor, and sure, the Tibetan movement's entering a new historical era, but it's also building up what seem like really firm foundations, as it were. Whereas the Uyghur movement, my sense is that the organizations are much newer, as it were.
The diaspora is kind of newer.
Yeah, it is. So, how do you see? Well, in part, I want to ask what you think are sort of the strongest organizations that stand up within these communities that are doing the good work today, ones that we might not think of, or that people at home might want to support or talk to. Or, do you see these organizations also evolving in the near future to adapt to their current challenges and pressures?
Yeah, let me give that a minute of think. I mean, like I said, I've seen in terms of organizations that I would full-heartedly support, these emerging youth organizations, whether it's grassroots organizations like Uyghur Youth Initiative in Germany, or cultural and just intergenerational networking type of organizations like the Time Network that has been doing really good work on sustainable community building So these more proactive and strategic thinking organizations that are not afraid to have the difficult conversations about the issues our communities are facing, and then to plan strategically and for sustainability of the movement. With regard to some of the more prominent organizations that I mentioned earlier, where has been over the past, I think, 2 years now, some of those leadership issues, allegations of misconduct, I think they are going to have to evolve. They are going to have to evolve, and they're going to have the harder discussions to move forward. This is not a time to wait it out. The youth certainly are not going to continue to work in the same fashion as previous generations have operated. They're building their own initiatives, they're moving forward, and they're connecting, they're building real influence.
So do you see similar conversations happening or organizational change taking place?
So we have this Central Tibetan Administration which act as a de facto government in exile, which was established by Dalai Lama back in 1959 when he first escaped Chinese occupation of Tibet. So within that umbrella of Central Tibetan Administration, which looks after, it has two main organizational missions. One is restoration of freedom for Tibetan people, and another one is to look after welfare of Tibetan refugees scattered around the world. So under this Central Tibetan Administration, there are so many different organizations, like youth organization like Students for Free Tibet, Tibet Action Group, and there are so many active organizations who are doing really wonderful work for fight against Chinese propaganda and Chinese colonization. And CDA functions, although CDA get about a quarter of its budget comes from US government through USAID. But it can, I believe it can function without US funding as well if need be. But my concern is there are so many different organizations like Student for Free Tibet, International Campaign for Tibet, and Tibet Action Group. These receive a significant of their funding from US government. So the cut of funding for these organizations really weakens the campaign for Tibet outside of Central Tibetan Administration. It's acting in a very formal way, but the other organizations, they have far more flexibility. So that's been completely weakened significantly. So that's something I'm really worried about.
Yeah. It's funny, I hate to say it, but it comes down to money. In all sorts of organizations, that is the system that we live under. It comes down to money. And when I talk to philanthropic organizations, they tell me we're extending ourselves as much as we can. We're giving more than ever, but there's no funder like the US federal government. And it's going to be really hard to make up this gap, right? And so flexibility will have to be important. In the meantime, I want to get back to that question of the arc of history and what you talked about as the illusion of normalization. We counted once, and this is a rough estimate, but for every one video on YouTube that's critical of what's happening in the Uyghur homeland in Xinjiang and Turkestan, there are 10 from the Chinese government talking about how great everything is here. Look, people are dancing, they're having fruits. And between the propaganda online and just the changes and people being able to go back home and not wanting to upset the government, there's this sense that things are falling back into a new normal, right? I don't know if you're fighting the same sense of normalization, but given that environment, how do we change the message about what's happening, or communicate clearly about it? How do we resist that illusion of normalization? Or should we lean into these changes and just accept that there's a new reality that we're dealing with?
Certainly not, I think. This has been, I guess, something that we've been dealing for years now, with sort of the cycle of tightening and easing of policies that China has implemented in the Uyghur homeland across the decades. Creates that sensible normalization when it eases up a little bit, like with this lifting of some of the travel restrictions. And we've had people who are, waiting to reunite with their families and hoping that things will go back to normal, as if there was a normal prior to 2017. There were egregious human rights abuses then. I mean, it escalated, there was recognized as a genocide, a crimes against humanity, and some of those policies have since then transformed, yes. But human rights abuses and egregious ones do continue. So this picture of everybody's happy and prosperous, come and see and dance, that's not realistic, and it's definitely not something that we should be leaning into. That's definitely not something that we should be normalizing. And I think that's something that we need to act more proactively and within the Uyghur community, not just activists, but members of the diaspora, trying to better understand the context on the ground, sort of lean off some of the old messaging that we've been utilizing for past couple of years, and really talk about how things are transforming, but not necessarily in a good way. There might not be as many of the active camps that there were before, but people are being transferred into more formal and detention facilities. They're being given longer prison sentences. There's still a crackdown on religious culture freedom. Intellectuals are still in detention. People are living under fear and oppression. I had a client who came recently, and she was worried about her immigration interview because she felt like she didn't actively face oppression because she herself was not detained or tortured. But she had a long list of family members that were in detention. She was forced to take off her hijab and not fast during Ramadan, really painting a picture of living in fear because of her identity, but brainwashed into thinking that that was an oppression because she was not detained or tortured. And I think that kind of normalization is happening in the homeland. And so we in the diaspora need to be really proactive about our messaging and not normalizing, because that's what China is trying to do. Like, they're expending just incredible amount of resources in multiple languages, with their global media influence to build this narrative of happy dancing Uyghurs, as if the genocide didn't happen.
In Ceylon a couple of years ago, I was at a workshop. I met someone from American academia who's well connected into the Chinese Academy. We were sort of talking. He said that, well, the PRC now considers the Tibet issue to be settled, and so it's freer to talk about Tibetan history than it ever has been for decades. It sounds like there's also a kind of period of illusory normalization happening around the Tibet issue, at least from where I'm sitting. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how do you deal with it?
I think I don't believe that's true. I mean, to begin with, it's really hard to get a clear information from inside Tibet. It's extremely restricted society. The tourists can't go to Tibet easily. And there was an act introduced in U.S. Congress, Tibet Reciprocity Act, which basically fired the Chinese restriction of U.S. tourists going to Tibet. But I believe that as long as there's some sort of repression, which still continues in Tibet, Tibetan people, I mean, fundamentally speaking, the Chinese and Tibetan people are very different. They may only look little similar in terms of their appearance, but in terms of cultural, food, religion, it's completely different. So this kind of distinctiveness and also this continued exploitation of Tibetan resources will, although the Chinese force may able to repress this for some time being, but ultimately, I think eventually it will come out, and I'm really worried about the period post Dalai Lama period. If Dalai Lama passes away in exile, then Tibet movement could become very difficult to control. So currently, almost 100% of Tibetan listens to his honest advice. But in future, I don't know. I mean, you can't keep repressing a group of people for too long. So eventually, it will kind of burst out. So I'm a little concerned about that. So
I'm going to ask one more selfish question. So I'm a historian by training. You brought up history many times. And I really like the way that you sort of characterize the arc of history, that actually we don't really know what's going to happen until it does. Things are impossible until they're possible and they already happened, and then you have to explain them. But history is a mushroom. It's actually mostly under the dirt, and it's only on one wet day you finally see the mushroom above the surface and say, of course, it's been there all the time. And I think with Tibet and with East Turkestan, it's really hard to get information from inside to know what's actually happening there. And with Chandra's Xi Jinping, we have even less transparency than we had under previous administrations. We don't really know what's happening. And I guess every day, I try to think of the words of a colleague who was disappeared in 2017, who told me that, this is China, these things happen, and then they stop. That there's a historical pattern of things being terrible until all of a sudden one day someone decides to change a policy, right? It was really hard to predict what might actually happen because you have so little information, as it were. So on a related note, I'm going to ask you a selfish question as someone who is tenured at a university, who does research on the Uyghur homeland, and who works toward the broader China space. Universities are 501c3 organizations. We can't take political stances. It's very, very clear what we do. But historically, universities have been important homes for work on and by Tibetan and Uyghur people. Well, Harvard has made exceptional contributions to this through funding of Uyghur studies over many years. Indiana has been home for this for decades. My own university has an endowment for Uyghur studies. We're very proud of that. We have strong Tibetan studies programs. And we're talking about two cultures that really seem to honor writers and thinkers and poets to a really significant degree. I kind of wonder, as someone who's at a university, and keeping in mind those limits around what's politically possible, how can universities help? What is the right place of a university in this broader ecosystem of thinking about these places, about the Uyghur homeland, about Tibet, and about these diasporas? Is there some kind of programming that you think would be particularly valuable to or attractive to the diaspora groups? Do you have any thoughts on these matters?
I like how you described history as a mushroom, a lot buried underneath. And I think digging that up, better understanding our history will help us better understand our present so we can better plan for our future. And for most Uyghurs growing up in the diaspora, they don't have access to that kind of education. Their parents certainly weren't instructed in the correct history of Eastern Turkestan. They, underwent communist education. So providing education to Uyghurs about their history, about their literature, helping them better understand themselves, I think is, one essential way that universities can help. Another is picking up some of the documentation and research that's now being defunded. We have a pretty good, I wouldn't say complete understanding of what went on in previous years, but how these policies are transforming now, how it's impacting Uyghurs on the ground in the homeland, what the Chinese government is doing in the diaspora in terms of the transnational repression, surveillance, monitoring, how they're documenting and building a data set of Uyghurs living in the diaspora through these interactions with Uyghurs going back and forth from this homeland. These are things that we don't have a lot of information on. Things that I was hoping that U.S. government funds would be able to support, but perhaps this is an area where academia can step in and really take on this research and work with Uyghur researchers. Well, over the past few years, U.S. government funding has helped train Uyghur researchers, helped fund initiatives for Uyghur researchers to develop their own projects, like the Uyghur Transnational Justice Database, the Uyghur Rights Monitor, and individual Uyghur researchers out there. So we have really capable people who have an understanding of the context, who have access to the homeland, albeit limited, and who are able to analyze and present that in a meaningful way. And working with researchers at universities, they can actually make sure that's disseminated, that's like presented and disseminated in a way that will help not just activists and human rights monitor, but policy makers make sound decisions about Uyghur rights in China.
Thank you.
I think me being a recipient of scholarship, it has tremendously helped me to do more work for Tibet-related issue. And I think if universities would provide some more scholarships for Tibetan diaspora community, and that will be very helpful. In fact, George Washington University has a program, Tibet Entrepreneurship Program, and many visitors they visit this program. And there's a program at Emory University. So I think these are extremely important programs that will have a very long-term impact. And another important thing that I think university as an institution where you foster free thinking, knowledge is concerned, I think it's important to provide a platform like this where more discussion around this, the Tibet and Uzbekistan, all these happens. Such platform will inform, and also another thing, important thing is to create a platform to discuss sort of roundtable discussion between the mainland Chinese student and the student from Tibetan community or
I
Uyghur,
wholeheartedly second that.
Uyghur community, just because they have been completely brainwashed by CCP from beginning from their forefathers. So when I came to Emory, I have two Chinese friends who came from mainland China, from Beijing, and one is from Xi'an. Yeah, one's from Xi'an and Beijing. And they, after spending 2 years with them, toward the end of the program, they told me that when I first initially met you, I told you guys are, we have two Tibetans in our program and two Chinese, and they said, I told you guys are very bad people, very people, but you guys turn out to be a pretty nice human beings. So that's what they told me. So that they have this kind of perception. So it's universities can really dispel such misconception.
I wholeheartedly agree with those comments. I've held the conversation too long. Let's open it up to the audience. I have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Please, here in the front.
Okay, it occurs to me that you might be able to promote boycott those brands, those products made by Uyghur slave labor. I didn't hear any mention of that possibility. And yet I can see the importance of the boycott. I can see the Trump, since he wants more stuff made here rather than there. Just strikes me as an obvious thing to do. I heard nothing about that.
Certainly. I mean, there are, ongoing boycotts. The Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor does a lot of work, both public campaigning and outreach to brands and companies that are tied to Uyghur forced labor. U.S. government, I think this is one area where not exactly at this moment too worried about the bill that I mentioned earlier, the piece of legislation to address Uyghur forced labor. They continue to list entities that are engaged in forced labor. So this work is ongoing. And yes, forced labor is one of the hot issues for the Uyghur advocacy community. It is an area where we have been able to leverage and really, I suppose make some meaningful progress in terms of actually getting some of those brands and companies that are involved out of that, as either they find other suppliers that might not be tainted by forced labor or divest completely. And I think that work is going to be ongoing. I hope that work is going to be ongoing, and the U.S. government will continue to support that work.
I should be able to name some brands.
Nike is one.
Yeah, I don't know.
There are quite a number. Muji, for example, explicitly was using Xinjiang coffee was labeled on some of their products for a while, right? There are dozens
A lot of
of
the brands that they're likely in some way complicit. check out the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor website. They've got, I think, close to 100 brands out there and like status in terms of any progress that they've made to remove Uyghur forced labor from their supply chains.
There are also sanctions in place on a number of entities in China by the US government, which have been enforced with some degree of efficacy. So there is a movement out there, but it's my understanding that the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor also gets a lot of resistance from companies when they try to give them evidence that their supply chain contains these things.
And that's why like consumers like actually reaching out to those brands is also very important. It's one thing for activists to go, but if we have a lot of consumers that are raising concern, that's going to amplify their efforts.
So let's further questions and thoughts in the back, please, Elise.
Yeah, so to bring it back to the administration and sort of what's been happening, with funding with the current administration. As someone who lost my own full-time job recently because of the foreign aid cuts, I'm really interested in I'm interested in, and I think a lot about, right, the practical implications of what is happening with funding cuts, just on the lives of people who have staffed organizations that are now having to let them go or to shut down entirely. And I think of folks at Radio Free Asia, maybe working for the Tibetan service or the Uyghur service, right, who were here on visa sponsorship. What's going on with that? Have either of you seen examples of people who are going to have to leave the United States as a result of these funding cuts?
I do know of a case, I'm not sure that they've left yet, but yeah, I have big concerns about this. I think initially there was this sentiment that, if you wait it out, things might improve. It doesn't seem so. And RFA, despite its shortcomings, was a critical resource within the Uyghur community. It helped break news about what's happening in the homeland. It was one of the first agencies to report on the mass atrocities. So that huge gap that it leaves is going to have a great impact on the community. I'm not sure of any efforts to try to fill that space with alternative media. I think more of the conservative Uyghurs are in the waited out game at this time.
Right, but yeah, I'm just thinking of, there are people I know who are on sponsorship from a country that might have a problem with the fact that they worked for a US-funded news organization, at least for a period, and I just, I guess,
Exactly.
I don't know that we can
And I think
say
some of those
definitive.
folks might have to just seek asylum here in the United States because it probably isn't going to be safe for them to return back into a more sensitive space that might have a problem with them doing sort of what they consider anti-China activities here in the United States.
But then in turn, I have a lot of concerns about what it would be like to be an asylum seeker right now that I don't think are, particularly unfounded given things we're hearing about. So just
challenging all around.
So any thoughts on this?
We have a lot of Tibetans in DC area who's working for VOA and RFA, and they lost their job because of these closure of RFA and VOA. So this is, of course, it has much bigger impact for overall Tibetan movement, but for the well-being of these individuals also are important. It's a major concern for sure.
But I'll just reflect on that and say, it's not just, for Radio Free Asia, VOA, it's not just jobs, they're jobs that can take someone who's lost everything, like a professor or researcher from the homeland, and put them in a position where they can buy a house and live something like the American dream. And for that to come to such a sudden end, I think it's just devastating.
And also most of those who are working for Tibetans who are working for, I think it's similar for Uyghur community, who are working for these RFA and VOA are scholars, they are historians, they are expert in Tibetan language. So it's a major issue.
Please.
You guys kind of touched on this a little bit, but my question is, especially with the election of Trump, a lot of Americans have this, the reason Trump ran on the whole America First agenda. So my question is, how do you appeal to the average American who's under this idea of America First? How do you appeal to them about the Uyghur community or the Tibetan community and how it directly impacts them. So I do think it can, but what's the correct way to frame it to an average guy from South Dakota about how investing in this issue and putting attention to this issue, because then in turn he's going to pressure his local officials to, focus on it. So how can you kind of frame that for the average American, I guess, to actually get actionable items from the U.S. government, the current U.S. government?
I have some few observations, like going up to the Hill as an activist, and I think first and foremost, Uyghurs are constituents too. We have like one of the largest communities in Uyghur diaspora communities in the United States here in Fairfax County, and then just spread out across the country. Not a huge population, but considerable constituents. So Uyghurs are Americans too. We're citizens who are being targeted by the Chinese government. So the rise of transnational repression in the United States by the Chinese government, that's not a foreign issue. That's a national security issue. So framing Uyghur rights issues not as some far off issue that's happening in Asia, but that are impacting Americans, Uyghur Americans, the United States' ability to protect its citizens in its own country, espionage, labor and trade, and which I think has really dominated sort of the Uyghur rights talk recently. It's the U.S. trade policy, but it goes beyond that, right? So I think really pointing out the stake and then really pointing out that, we have Uyghur constituents as a representative. You're working for your constituents, which include Uyghurs. These advancement of Uyghur rights, protections of Uyghur Americans here on American soils, these all advance American national security and American interests.
I think for the supporter of America First policy, I think the one thing that could derail this mission of America First, I believe it's a rapid and aggressively growing China under the Communist Party of China. There was a book by former top China advisor to Biden, Raj Doshi. The book is Long Game, in which he details how China strategically plans to overthrow United States, and that's not in the interest of United States. So in that pursuit, the Tibetans and Uyghurs are some of the strongest and most consistent entity that fight against this Communist Party. So basically, to support this movement is in long run supporting the United States itself. It's a national security interest for sure.
So it's interesting you brought up Rush Doshi, who was part of the Biden administration, brought up the labor issue, which I think is something we need to emphasize more because that succeeds with left-wing people as well. You brought up security, which is increasingly a bipartisan consensus in DC. But one of the main framings I've heard around the Uyghur issue, the Tibetan issue, has been religious freedom over the past year. What do you think of that framing? Is that still active? Is that still persuasive?
I'm not sure how active it is, but even then, I thought it was a bit limiting, the just very strict religious freedom framing. There are other framings that I would love to push that I'm told is not going to work in this environment, such as like the anti-colonial framing, which, but I think we need to diversify in our approaches, reach out to non-traditional partners, take on non-traditional approaches. The Uyghur rights issue is a climate issue, it's an environment issue, it's a labor issue. It's, just take in sort of like the broad spectrum of human rights without limiting us to just religious freedom or communism, anti-communism sort of framings. And I think as we're navigating the space, these are things that we should be talking about and strategizing and really thinking about, like what's next and how are we going to move the Uyghur movement forward, and how are we going to frame those things, and how are we going to do it in a way that's proactive and adaptive and not one that's like other people are framing for us.
I think the narrative about these issues, Tibetan and Uyghur issues, only being a religious kind of issue, I think it's to a great extent it's a result of Chinese assertiveness in terms of diplomacy. So when the countries say it's kind of, it's just a human rights issue or it's a religious issue, I think they are being a little cautious of the repercussion from China. So I don't think country like United States or in case of Tibetan, the way Tibetan government in exile is it's located in India. I don't think country like India and United States should be too cautious when they talk about Tibet, because ultimately it's in interest of US and it's certainly in the interest of Indian government for sure.
So are you both suggesting we need to frame Tibetan Uyghur issues as global existential issues? Because you said it's a climate issue. You said it's something that should be of interest to all countries. But how is it a climate issue? How do we address that how do we place this set of problems into that broader global challenge?
Yeah, I mean, with the rise of authoritarianism, the challenges that China poses to the rest of the world, the economic degradation of not just East Turkestan but Tibet. Tibet has been like proactive on, the Tibet issue being an environmental issue for years now, almost decades. So like broadening the scope and like moving us. I think when we talk about human rights, people think about just freedom of speech or like religious freedom, and it's very limited. So making sure that we're reaching out and trying to take on those non-traditional flames and broaden our horizons, I think is going to be really important. And there is like you mentioned earlier, Tibet is a critical resource for China. So is East Turkestan, a gateway to Europe. And for years now, the United States, Turkey, other governments with significant Uyghur populations have supported Uyghur rights, but they've also had other interests in doing so. And so I think we need to expand our messaging not to just the framings that we were restricted to, but broaden that in a way that we ally up with more non-traditional partners, not just in the United States, across the globe. And this is something that I was starting to see. There was much more engagement with the global South in the recent year or so, and I think that was going to increase. I think there was going to be efforts to engage Muslim majority countries, definitely more talks of engaging on like sort of the settler colonialism issue, and maybe that's not something that you do on the Hill, but this is something that on the long run you're developing allies, you're developing a narrative and framing that will position your issue as something that's important, not just as like a human rights issue off somewhere off in China, but something that impacts the globe.
Yes.
Okay, first, a comment that follows up on that, which is just that I've thought for a while now that one possible framing that works is, like you were just saying, like Uyghurs are constituents. Many of the Uyghurs who have lost jobs and are, facing, economic and other financial issues as a result of it now, they're Americans. And it's kind of America first for Americans to have jobs, right? Like these organizations funded American jobs in one sense. That wasn't the only thing they did, but it was one thing they did. And it's in everyone's economic interest, like for your neighbors, for our neighbors to have jobs, right? Like that drives an economy too.
But is there food?
There is food, but before we break for food for the in-person attendees, I also have a couple questions that came in online, and I'm gonna try to just combine them
Sure, I agree. Yes, that sounds great.
and sum up, and maybe we can end after this online question. So yeah, there have been several different things, but maybe the way to sum them all up is just to ask a really practical question. Are there organizations that are still receiving funding from the Trump administration in the Uyghur and Tibetan rights and other spaces? And then on a related vein, where we have seen funding be cut, is there anyone else who seems like they can take up the funding mantle so that important work can continue? And maybe that's where we stop.
So annually, as I mentioned before, the the Tibet Policy Act of US 2022. Through this, we receive annually about around $30 million annually for various Tibet related programs. That includes running of RFA, VOH, Tibet section, and also running of the Office of Special Coordinator for Tibet, which is housed at the State Department. Many of these programs has been cut, but for about $8 million goes to Central Tibetan Administration, and that has recently been restored. And we are also looking for funding from different other countries like Canada.
I can't say for certain like whichever groups might be resuming funding. I've heard that some were able to get their funding back, but it's uncertain whether that funding will be renewed. There's a concern that some organizations are on their way out because they primarily relied on US government funding. In terms of alternative sources of funding, Eric mentioned earlier, there's this huge gap that USG funding has created. Private funders are struggling to fill that gap, so there's a lot of competition for funding right now. I'm not quite too sure about. I've seen some very small funding pop up from different organizations like in Europe, some for cultural and like language types of activities. In terms of another sort of government that might help fill in that space, I'm not sure. I think there are some talks and some governments might be interested, but I don't think they're going to be able to, provide the level of support that the US government had in recent years. But one thing that I had been working toward too, and sustainability has been something that I've been emphasizing, and financial sustainability too, developing community source funding. We've had some time to develop our community. The Tibetan community is a little bit more developed, but we have professionals, we have, wealthy individuals within the community. So doing that outreach and really generating some community supported funding, probably not going to happen anytime too soon, but I was hoping that if the US government funded had continued, we'd be moving in that direction. We'd be building not just capacity, but sustainability, using the resources that were available to us. That's going to be much more challenging now.
Would you like to wrap there?
Do you have any closing words?
My closing words are, thank you once again very much to our speakers, Dr. Sale and Rigdon, just come all the way down from New York City into Ajmer Siddhavalde. I really appreciate these remarks. I appreciate the candor as well, because this is a difficult topic to discuss, especially in this environment, where I think a lot of people are afraid of saying anything for fear of maybe being perceived as critical, and thus maybe being cut off from potential future sources of funding. But this kind of honesty is what actually creates the kind of trust and that moral strength that we were talking about earlier. It's a sort of space where you have to have the conversations that you were both advocating for, that bring people together, even if they end up on different sides of things. So I want to thank you very much for this, for giving us a few notes of potential optimism, for laying out the situation very realistically. And I look forward to hearing more from you in the coming years. And thank you again to our audience and to the New Lines Institute for having us.